Ah yes, progressive overload. You hear about that all the time, people saying focus on progressive overload in your workouts, and for good reason. Because if exercise was a drug, then progressive overload would be the active ingredient. But one of the biggest myths and misconceptions about this progressive overload is it's about weight. It's about how much mass you're moving against Earth's gravity. So theoretically, if I'm curling this 20-pound dumbbell and I go to 25, then I have more progressive overload, in theory. However, we need to recognize that what progressive overload is really talking about isn't the weight or the resistance, it's how much actual tension is in the muscle. So case in point, if I'm strictly curling 20 pounds and oh yeah, feeling the bicep work, and then I grab this 45 and I'm just winging and slinging it around, like yeah, it's heavier weight, but my arm is actually working less hard than it was lifting that 20 pounder. So on paper, it sounds like I have progressive overload, but without more work on the actual muscle, you don't have it. You can achieve progressive overload many different ways, which is good because if you're only looking at one way to achieve that progressive overload, you kind of paint yourself into a proverbial corner with your training where you use one method like adding weight, and that can work great for so long, but then you're gonna just get to a point where you can't keep going with that and you plateau and you're kind of stuck. But if you implement multiple ways of achieving progressive overload, now you've got a lot of different directions you can go in and keep yourself developing over time without the burnout, the risk of injury, and those long-standing plateaus. So throughout this video, I'll be referring to my table of progressive elements. This is my table, kind of like of the elements in chemistry class that I created in my second book of smart bodyweight training that you can use 9 different variables for progressing calisthenics. But this applies to any form of strength training because fundamentally it's still about the same thing. So the first element, the one in the center of that table, is tension. And this is probably the easiest and most straightforward place to start because a lot of times we have poor tension control, especially along the muscles in the backside. So I always recommend like my overcoming isometrics, like here, I'm doing a rear fly with my iso loop, and I'm working on being able to contract my traps, my rear deltoids. And yeah, I know it doesn't look like much, it's not fancy, but it's one of the best ways to practice controlling and generating tension in the muscle, and therefore it produces more tension in that connection for greater progressive overload in anything that you do. The next progressive variable you can use is speed. And speed works in a very interesting way because we can produce progressive overload in the muscle by going faster because we have to generate more tension in the muscle in order to produce that power. Or you can also generate progressive overload by going slower, which means you're not using as much momentum and you're also producing tension for a greater period of time in those points in your range of motion that are more difficult, like at the top of this row. The next variable is range of tension. Not quite range of motion, which I'll explain in a minute, but this one is basically meaning go with a bigger range. So if I'm usually pressing, and this is coming down to about my eye level, and I can now progress to a deeper range, that's gonna theoretically produce more demand on the muscles working. But remember, I said range of tension, not necessarily range of motion. So if I'm producing tension only in this range, and then I gotta relax to go deeper, kind of like dropping or falling into a squat, for example, well, you've got more range of motion, but you don't have tension in that range. So that's why it's important, again, that tension control to still keep the muscles tense, tricep, shoulder, and stuff. And not only does that keep stress out of your joints, but it also ensures you're getting more benefit for that extra range. Angle to gravity. This one's a little bit more on the calisthenics realm of things, particularly with suspension straps, simply meaning that the more you move directly against the pull of gravity, coming down, I'm now increasing resistance on my working limbs, and therefore creating progressive overload. But there are cases in like strength training, weightlifting world where this applies as well. For example, like if you're lifting a couple of 45s on a 45-degree leg press, of course you can lift more weight there because you're at a 45-degree angle. But if you're doing, say for example, a vertical leg press, if you can find one of those, or if you're just using regular squats, now you're moving the weight more directly against gravity. So that's going to be much more resistance with the same weight. The weight shifting element, again, more of a calisthenics thing where instead of keeping your weight perfectly balanced between your right and left side of your body, you shift more weight onto one side, so there's more weight or your body weight onto that limb, and therefore it's working a lot harder. And in the world of external load from an external weight, it's usually basically saying, instead of going with bilateral, going with a unilateral style lift, where now I'm forcing one side to work, and the other side is more of like creating stability along the left lateral chain. And some people find that this is a good way to moderate any sort of imbalances, but it's also a way to force the nervous system to focus on generating tension in one side, and you don't have to necessarily spread it out as much, so it creates a little bit more focus in that area. The extension element, usually more particular with some exercises like stretch outs on the straps here, ab wheels, that sort of thing. Basically, the more you extend yourself out, you're more using leverage to create a greater demand for more tension on the working muscles. This element can apply particularly well for anything where the arms are extended out from your center line. So if you're doing, for example, like chest flies, and my arms are slightly bent, if I go with much more extended arms, same weight, but now my chest has to work significantly harder, just trying to reach out all the little bit more can make all the difference in the world. And then on the outskirts of the table of elements, of course, you have time, which is a number of things. That's the number of sets you do, the number of reps you do, your rest periods, that sort of thing. And some people consider that overload, some people not, because the actual tension in the muscle isn't really changing, but the amount of duration of that tension is, so it might have more of an application in like hypertrophy sort of thing. Take it and use it as you will. And of course, just good old-fashioned weight. You know, just how much weight you are moving against Earth's gravity, either adding weight to you or lifting a heavier weight and stuff like that. So it is certainly a progressive element, but it's by no means the one and only way that we can use to create progressive overload. Just remember that ultimately, it's not about just the weight, because you can reduce many of those variables in the name of chasing after heavier weights and actually not have much more progressive overload, and even maybe even decrease it a little bit. So keep your attention focused on trying to create more tension in the muscle and make the muscle itself working harder, and using all of these as just tools and ways that you can vary the demand upon that muscle to give you many different ways to produce that progressive overload. Let me know if you have questions down below. More videos here. Thank you very much for watching. Be fit and live free.